Chapter 12. Creation. We have suggested evolution out of the mind stuff, through feeling and thought, as the essential process of creation. The primal undifferentiated being takes form. The movement out of itself is emotion, feeling. The form into which it moves is thought. The material world, the world of creation, is, as physical science suggests, movement under various forms. Let us consider it more closely. The protozoic cell moves towards food. There is motion, which we may, if we like, associate with chemical action or chemotaxis. But we cannot refuse also to see that there is a simultaneous emotion or desire for food in the cell consciousness. The repetition of this movement towards food evolves at last a dim perception of relationship, a thought of the object as food, and with this thought of relation, and the repeated action which the object thus excites, comes structure, as of the evolution of tentacles, or swimming apparatus, by which the food may be pursued or seized. Later on in evolution, objects are conceived not only as food, but as fear or anger or jealousy, or what not. Objects, of course, are not fear or anger, but they wake these qualities and feelings, and so build the body and the life of the being concerned. They call forth the new births within the soul, which determine its manifestation in the world. Fear oft repeated calls forth the long ears of the rabbit or the donkey, or gives to the monkey its structure for climbing trees. Later again, the me sense is called forth, and descends into operation within man. It too desires food, the applause of others, and so leads to modification of structure, to adaptations of morals and manners, such as will secure the approval of fellow beings. Looking at things in this way, we seem to see how, through ages on the earth, not only the great needs and emotions have given rise to whole races and tribes of plants and animals, but the detailed forms of these have been thought out through processes most closely resembling our own human thinking. If for a moment one considers the working of the latter, how, if one wishes to solve any question, the image-making faculty within supplies a host of chance suggestions, one of which at last is found to be the form required. Or if we consider how the human race at large has worked out any great problem, say that of shipbuilding, how through centuries and thousands of years, tiny suggestions and modifications have been thrown out by innumerable thinkers, most of which have failed, and been discarded in the struggle, but some of which have succeeded and been adopted, and how at last the form of a modern ship has emerged. We see at once that the process by which through the centuries the forms of a stag or a walnut tree have been produced are quite similar. They have been thought out. The image-making faculty in each generation of deer or tree has thrown out, chiefly in the seed, casual variations, suggestions, most of which have failed, but some have been adopted. Each individual tree or animal has contributed its tiny share of thought and ingenuity to the success or failure of its own life, and so of the form which it represents. In the vast succession of individuals, of generations, the total mass of accumulated thought and ingenuity has built itself and embodied itself in the marvelous beauty, expressiveness, and meaning of the stag or of the tree. These forms, and the forms of man himself, and of the different races of man, are, quote, the result of the selection and chiseling of thousands of minds through the centuries. And at once, when we realize this view of nature and creation, we realize our part in it, our continuity with it all, and the power hitherto undreamed of, which we may yield, if we only seize the whole process in ourselves and at its very source. Here then, at this point, comes a change of conception. All down the race life before us, this process of creation, through intermediary feeling and thought, has been going on a vast scale and over our heads, as it were. We have been like puppets in the game, and all these wonderful race things, these swift powers, these weaknesses and disabilities, which we inherit in our bodies, we have looked upon as fatal in their domination over us, not to be escaped from, not to be resisted. But now comes a new conception. This ego which all down the ages has come building up and slowly perfecting the expression of itself, is there still. We are that ego. It is not an alien tyrant dominating us. It is our very self. It is not somewhere back in the dark infinite. It is here, and with this recognition, all life is changed. The whole life of the race from which we have come, the whole route, the whole series of thought processes by which we have descended, is, it cannot be too often repeated, within us, in our bodies, in our subconscious selves. It is not that we have to go rambling afar through great eons of uncertain history and biology to find this race life. It, or that branch of it to which we belong, is here and now in our bodies. The memories, the accumulated experiences, habits, the whole thought concatenation which has built them up, is there, only waiting to be brought again into consciousness. Every one of these organs, the eye, the liver, the thyroid gland, or what not, has been built up for a special use by intensely conscious selective thought. It is, in fact, at this moment, a habit of thought, having, of course, like every thought structure, a definite form, and capable of being taken up into consciousness again. The whole life which has been thought out and expressed in the race before us is in our bodies, and something more, or that which has not yet got itself expressed. The primal being in which all thoughts of necessity inhere, which underlies all thoughts and contains myriads yet unexpressed, is in us. It is there and accessible to our consciousness. When we reach to it, we reach the source of all power. We are in the habit of regarding our bodies as material legacies from the past, that is, as things unintelligent and therefore essentially unintelligible, and accept them, as I have said, as a kind of lumbering fate or destiny, which we may struggle against indeed, but to which we must eventually succumb. But let us look at them as mental legacies, as congeries of custom, habits, views, prejudices, thought forms, handed down, and immediately the whole aspect of the life problem is changed. The thought habits thus crystallized in us may not be the best we can imagine. They may be inchoate forms of the race life, destined to be replaced by superior forms. New needs, emotions, surging within us may find our present outlines inadequate. But the point is that our bodies now will no longer appear as alien and separate things from our minds, but as our own race mind made visible, and as essentially continuous with and undivided from that which we more specially call ourselves. And instantly it becomes clear that our bodies, instead of oppressing like a nightmare, may become our most willing servants, and may even be capable of the most extraordinary and unexpected transformations. For consider for a moment the thought nature of the mind, that which we call, specially mental, in ourselves. A man's conscious mind, we know it only too well, is a mass of habitual thoughts, prejudices, ways of looking at things. It has often a most rigid outline. Here is a hard and fast Tory, or a Plymouth Brother, or a screaming radical, or an obdurate secularist. The form of the mind is distinct and set. One can almost feel its shape, as if it were a body. Indeed, one can detect its shape in the curves and lines of the body itself. And this mental form in such cases is so set that it offers the greatest resistance to the entry of a new thought. You talk in vain to a person of such type. You adduce arguments, instances. You press new facts upon him. But these things roll off again and effect no lodgment. Yet at last, when as it were by a surgical operation, a new idea is really introduced into his mind, how astonishing the change! How often a single suggestion or hint from nature or history, finding its way at last into the brain of some biblical Calvinist, has brought the whole structure of his religion or superstition to the ground, and turned him into an implacable free thinker. In such cases, the power of a single idea, germinal as every idea is with a certain life of its own, is something almost terrible. The old thought structure gives way before it. Devastation spreads through the unseen chambers. The man thinks he is going mad, or really loses his reason for a time. Then he emerges, his faculties and activities keyed upon a new conception of life, his mental outlook and habit altered, his body even notably changed. Or the free thinker in his turn, and by exactly similar process, is transformed into a spiritualist, and the change is written on his face. This power, this vitality of a single thought or conception, and its capacity for growth or multiplication from itself like a living organism, are things which I think have not been sufficiently appreciated. It is not only that one hitherto unconsidered thought or fact may destroy a whole system of philosophy or of science, may act like a poison on such system unless it can be properly assimilated and digested, but that a similar thought may multiply in the brain of a man and transform his whole existence. Here is a plain man who has led a workaday life for some years, honest and decent and respected by his neighbors. One day a chance speculation, perhaps in the markets, perhaps on the turf, unexpectedly successful, sets him thinking. The idea that he can make money, can get rich, effects a lodgment in his mind. A kind of fever ensues. The one idea spawns, generates, and multiplies itself. In a few weeks or months the man is deep in all kinds of manner of plans, schemes, and speculations. In a few years he is a millionaire, and a pest to himself and society. He is altered in mind and deeply altered in physique and bodily habit. This one idea of money-making, very old in the race experience, and generating and propagating itself down the centuries, has still enormous vitality, and fastening itself today upon thousands of brains, and their spawning, completely monopolizes and subverts them, reducing them to a kind of slavery, even as it might be some fell disease. And seriously, the question may be asked, whether the microbial organisms which our scientific instruments reveal to us are not indeed the external forms of beings, which seen from within would appear to us as simple or rudimentary states of mind, whether each microbe, which constitutes or is associated with a disease, is not representative of some attitude of mind, like fear or worry, inimical and baneful to the human organism, while those microbes which are associated with health are representative of constructive and harmonious mental attitudes. The planet on which we live swarms with highly complex organisms, which we call human bodies, and we are so constituted that we cannot help crediting each such body with an internal aspect or mentality, which we call its mind, also highly complex. As we range down through the animal kingdom, we can hardly help doing the same thing, and crediting each simpler organism with a correspondingly less complex state of mind. When, therefore, we reach the simplest forms, like bacilli, whose whole life action consists in one or two very simple operations, including perpetual self-propagation, is it not natural to suppose that each such organism indicates a state of mind of a very simple or rudimentary type, a single organic thought or desire, as we might call it, incessantly concerned in a certain form of action and in the repetition and reproduction of itself? Shall we actually discover, ere long, the bacillus of fear or of money-greed, or of vanity, or of ambition? It does not seem so very improbable. Why are certain bodily diseases associated with certain mental temperaments? Why are those thoughts that are in the air, like microbes, some beneficial, some baneful? What are those microbes which swarm from one brain to another, like thoughts? Professor Eli Metchnikoff, in his last book, The Nature of Man, says that there is a class of tiny organism he calls microphage, which in old age gnaw and eat away the brain and other organs. What does worry do? Is it a microphage? But leaving this question of the special interpretation we are to give to microbes, let us return to the general fact that our bodies are the legacies of the immemorial thought of our ancestors, that they are those thought forms, habits, prejudices, consolidated into definite shape and function. Then does it not seem clear what a power a new feeling or thought may have, and may exercise in disturbing or readjusting the organization of the body? That conversions and other such experiences change folk in the most amazing way is a fact we have already alluded to. Such things not only shatter and rebuild people's minds, but also their bodies. Simply, it would appear, because the body is also a system of habits and thought forms, like the mind, and a system lying in close relationship, in fact, really continuous, with what we call mind. And does it not seem clear that in cases new thoughts may enter and disturb or modify the body directly, without passing through or delaying in the mind, or at any rate without disturbing it? Perhaps because the mind has already assimilated or is familiar with them. I know of cases in which the receipt of so-called bad news, while leaving the mind quite untroubled and serene, has caused a complete prostration of the body for some days. And everyone knows of the wonderfully heartening effect on the body of a piece of good news, even at times when the conscious man has forgotten the intelligence, or is not paying special heed to it. No doctor is unaware of the importance of instilling courage and faith into his patient. This attitude of mind apparently spreads through the body, confirming and strengthening its organic processes. Doubt and despair are equally disorganizing. A cruel word, wounding the heart, may paralyze all strength in the limbs. One little thought or feeling, and the whole body structure deranged. But naturally, those parts of the body or consolidated racial mind, which are most recent and nearest to the conscious mind, are most easily affected by new thought. The more complex nerve centers, the more recently formed plexuses, representing and embodying more highly wrought thought and emotion, are more easily modified, more easily perhaps upset, than the more primitive and simple. In insanity, it is the higher thought forms and later developed bodily faculties, the moral nature, the extended coordination of the limbs, which first give way. In drunkenness, the same. The man plumps down on all fours because the leg center, at the top of the brain, was in his long history one of the latest formed, and here the thought habit of uprightness dwells. In hypnotic suggestion, a single notion introduced may strangely transmute a man's actions, physiognomy, or even senses of taste or smell. It may act poisonously or curatively on his body. Still, in all these cases we do not expect to find the fundamental outlines of the body changed, the bones, the muscles, the forms and functions of the organs. Or, if so, we can only expect the alteration to be very slow and gradual. And this, even though we admit the body's close affinity in itself to thought and to mind, is perfectly natural and rational. For the physical structure of the body, muscles and organs, is immensely old and represents thought habits which have been allowed and confirmed and verified by countless generations, and it is not likely they are going to give way at once to some upstart new idea, any more than a blooming old Tory is likely to have his political faith upset by the first young radical shaver who comes along. Nevertheless, the bones and muscles and solider parts of the body are altered by thought. Sandow has shown us that. He has particularly insisted on the great influence which concentration of the mind exercises on the growth of the muscles. Everyone must have noticed how certain attitudes of mind are associated with certain attitudes of body, courage and faith with an erect carriage, depression and doubt with bent back and uncertain gait, and so forth. It is clear that when certain attitudes of mind become permanent and habitual, they must permanently alter the carriage and structure of the body. Again, that the chemical nature of the secretions from the various glands and organs is altered in connection with the various emotions, joy, fear, grief, pain, love, and so forth, is a well-known fact, and it is obvious that when these states of mind persist, permanent alterations of the functions of the organs must follow. Thus we arrive, and the human race is arriving, at the conscious use of the formative power. We are arriving at one of the most fruitful and important turning points in the history of the race. The self is entering into relation with the body. For that the individual should conceive and know himself, not as a toy and chance product of his own bodily heredity, but as identified and continuous with the eternal self, of which his body is a manifestation, is indeed to begin a new life and to enter a hitherto undreamed world of possibilities. It begins to dawn on us that, identifying ourselves with this immortal self, we also can take part consciously in the everlasting act of creation. To still the brain and feel our identity with that deepest being within us is the first thing. There, in that union, in that identity, all the sins and errors of the actual world are done away. We are most truly ourselves. We go back to the root, from which all that may really express us must inevitably spring. Remaining there in silence as long as may be, then out of that state will inevitably spring a wave of conscious feeling, of joy, courage, love, expansion, or whatever it may be. A feeling not foreign or fabricated or ephemeral, but deeply rooted and expressive of our real life. Then holding on to that root idea, that feeling, that emotion, that desire, whatever it may be, confident in its organic rightness and constructive power, holding steadily to it for a time, perfectly naturally and inevitably out of it will flow certain forms of thought. The feeling will take shape. It will clothe itself in images of things actual, and already the process will have begun, by which those things will be created or realized in the world. All consciousness is motor, says William James, and no sooner does the new emotion or desire come within the border of consciousness than it sets the springs of action in motion, which inevitably flow down to creation and the outer world. It is not that any violent act of will is required for the realization of things in this outer world. It is rather that by non-acting we should identify ourselves with the great process of creation forever going on. There is will, certainly. There is control and power in holding and concentrating on any given feeling or thought. But it is not the violent will which would seek to wrest materials from their places. The driver of a locomotive does not jump down and seek forcibly to turn the wheels of his engine, but moving one or two levers, he controls the great driving forces at their source. So handling the levers of feeling and thought, we can already send the forces of nature in our bodies and elsewhere, along the lines which we desire. Long and persevering must the practice and exercise be, by which power to direct thought and feeling may be attained, and by which the sense of identity with the universal self may be established. For without this latter, all our work must inevitably turn out vain and ephemeral. But when the conditions are fulfilled, then strangely obvious is the result and simple the act of creation.